Thank you, Sandra. Good morning, everyone. I have two very important things to tell you. First is to pass on the best regards of James Robertson, who is the National Manager of Forensic and Technical at the AFP, Australian Federal Police. So many of you would know James. So I couldn't make it, but hopefully his spirit will go through this presentation. And of course, I have to thank NIJ for the invitation. It was very nice. And the other thing I share with James, in addition to my passion for trace evidence, probably you've understood now, it's my typical Australian accent. If you want to embed in the Australian culture, there is a good crowd from down under here, so please come and have beers with us. Okay, a bit of, like Stephen did, a bit of geography. This is Australia and this is New Zealand. What I want to show you here is just to, and I'll have another slide showing you the size of the country. But the first thing, like the United States, it's a federal system. So it impacts on the way forensic science is provided, or forensic science services are provided, because every state has, of course, its own jurisdiction. So it's a first very important point. Compared to Europe, or even the United States, it's a very small country population-wise, which makes things sometimes easier, but sometimes it makes things much more difficult. Advantage over Europe, there is one common language, one common legal system, which helps. Now, if I go to show you the size, so sorry, this slide dropped Tasmania and New Zealand. You can see, basically, the UK here, and the United States. So it's pretty much a very similar size as the United States, but it has only 21, 22 million people, 4 million approximately in New Zealand, probably double amount of number of sheep in New Zealand. So it has a big impact on the way we do business. And it's quite often people compare Australia to Canada in terms of the geography and the way the forensic business can be provided. Now, let's be realistic and serious. Although we all like trace evidence and we are passionate, this is real stuff. Especially when you talk to New Zealand, this is what really matters. More seriously. So I mentioned multi-jurisdictions. So it's a first big important concept when we talk about the way we do business. So the provision of forensic science services can vary, and it varies. It can be essential, one-stop shop front, where we have full service labs embedded with field services, crime scene, or most commonly, states have two main services, field and labs, quite often separated. So you've got field with police and laboratories under another kind of government laboratory. Sometimes we even have 3 different services or even more. So you have different government laboratories. So you can see it can be very different. The main groups, we've got the National Institute of Forensic Science, which is a sort of similar to an FSTC, although a bit different, but it deals a lot with quality assurance, best practice, training, supporting research, communication, sharing information, and so on. SMANSFL, a horrible acronym, it's Senior Managers of Australian and New Zealand Forensic Laboratories. It's the equivalent of your ASCLD, or for Europeans, that would be NFC. So it's all lab managers, meeting, networking, putting strategic directions in place. Now, the important thing under SMANSFL, there is what we call SAGs, it's specialist advisory groups. So they are the equivalent of all working groups like NFC groups in Europe or your SWIGs in the US. So they deal with things like, discussing guidelines, best practice, talking about case studies, sharing information, method validation, and so on. So it's really at the science level. Now, because of the size of the population and the size of the forensic services, there is one main group which encompasses all trace evidence disciplines, which is a criminalistics SAG or CSAG. Now, interestingly, we have to talk about biology. The BSAG has had now more and more interest in trace evidence because of the advent of trace DNA. So bingo, people start to think about trace now in DNA. Another thing that is probably important to mention is the increasing interest in R&D in Australia and New Zealand. There has been an increasing number of cases, a number of projects, a lot of opportunities for funding and various projects in recent times, especially NIFS had quite a significant funding for various projects related to explosives and closed-set DNA. Now, what happened in the last 10 years? The first thing, talking about operations, Australia has been increasingly involved in major incidents. So you've probably all heard about Bali bombings, known as Bali 1 and Bali 2, the Marriott Hotel, the Australian Embassy in Jakarta, and of course the tsunami. It has an impact, although the tsunami is probably not so much to do with trace evidence, but overall it has a huge impact because it impacts on the resources. And for a small country population-wise, it's a very important point to remember. When you send people abroad for operations, you are really thin for whatever happens at home. And it brought a lot of questions about how best we can deal with trace evidence, especially in the Bali bombings, how best we can analyze various samples, explosive traces and so on, very close to the scene and very quickly. Now, another significant development, sorry, I have to talk about DNA. DNA had a major impact, as previous speakers mentioned before. I think we cannot, forget that. And impacted in Australia and New Zealand as well. There has been a huge impact, but what it did, basically, it created a new benchmark. I mean, we can discuss that, but it's true that it affected the status, the resources of trace evidence. It impacted on lab infrastructure, on processes, and the evidence mix is pretty much altered because of the advent of DNA. It raised the bar of forensic evidence interpretation. We can argue, we can discuss a lot of things about numbers, no numbers, or whatever, but the reality is, unfortunately, maybe, in trace evidence or non-DNA trace evidence, we are quite often compared to DNA when we talk about interpretation. Then DNA continues to evolve, and now there is a new emphasis, especially when we talk about trace DNA, about how DNA was transferred, how it could come here. And then I think this is very important because it's at the core of criminalistics and trace evidence. So I think, the DNA field can learn a lot from us, and there is a big opportunity here to really team up and have a holistic approach. It puts a new emphasis on reconstruction of events, and it sets new challenges for trace evidence. Other things that happened in the last 10 years, of course, it's some progress made towards a better understanding of the value of trace evidence. Several studies, and Stefan mentioned Bayesian statistics, but there are a lot of things that were done, different surveys to help a bit, but however, it's probably not enough. Major improvement in analytical instrumentations in terms of sensitivity, specificity, so big improvements there. And I think probably more importantly, progress with respect to instrument miniaturization. So the whole thing here is to try to bring the laboratory to the scene or very close to the scene instead of bringing samples back to the lab. So the technology can help. It's probably not fully here, but it's coming our way. The risk here is with emerging technologies is really to make sure that we find their right place in the new environment. Otherwise, I have another talk later this week, and I'll mention that there is a risk that the new technology becomes a gadget. Another thing, I mentioned the size of the country population-wise, and of course, the end result is a question of resources. Ultra-specialization is not viable anymore. So for most forensic labs in Australia, it's not possible to have, say, one person doing glass and only glass for their whole career. The same thing for fibers and so So there is a move and a need to try to take trace evidence more from a generalist approach. And in trace evidence, it can be seen as materials-focused scientist with the ability to apply microscopic techniques in the front end, followed by more specialized analytical techniques. However, for some types of trace evidence, you need to get to some level of really cutting-edge expertise. So what can we do about that? Especially for cases like, for example, soils in Australia, where we don't have enough cases to keep or develop the expertise and don't have enough cases to do the analysis in-house. So there has been a lot of discussion about centers of specialization. So for example, for soil, the CSIRO, which is a federal research organization, teamed up with a local university in Adelaide, which is in South Australia, and the forensic provider there to develop the forensic soil Australian, I think the full name is Australian Centre for Forensic Soil Analysis. So what are the issues? One first issue that we see from Australia and New Zealand is the need for forensic science to be more proactive. I mentioned the examples of Bali, but there are a lot of other examples. Try to provide better intelligence earlier in the investigation. I'll mention that in my talk on Thursday, but there is a dilemma here, whether we want 99.99999% of accuracy, but 6 months down the track, or whether it's better to have a bit less accuracy, but have quick answers for the investigation. So it's debatable. Another big issue, when you talk to people in the labs, it's backlogs, 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 backlogs. So there are increasing pressures to reduce turnaround times, no different to DNA. Now, I'll make this comment, and I know that James would be very happy with this comment, is the backlog of forensic laboratories is not an analytical issue. Because if it was an analytical issue, we wouldn't have any DNA backlog. So it's more about the time that is needed to search, triage all the samples given to the laboratory. Another thing, I had to continue with DNA bashing here. When we talk about increased sensitivity of instrumentation and portable instruments, it's pretty clear that it raises some contamination and interpretation issues. The further we go in sensitivity and all these things, the more careful we need to be. I mean, it's pretty obvious. Another thing, I had this comment made by several practicing forensic scientists saying that potentially we are self-destroying ourselves in trace evidence because we are putting more and more techniques, more and more high-tech analysis, more and more things in the lab. It takes more and more time to do the analysis. But at the end of the day, we don't provide the same resources to answer the main question of interpretation, like Troy mentioned before and Stefan. So in the end, we do more and more work. It takes more and more time, more and more backlog. But do we really deliver better information to the criminal justice system or law enforcement? Troy mentioned the tyranny of numbers. I mean, it's pretty clear that this is a real issue. We really have to discuss interpretation. It's a very important topic. Again, the more and more tests rarely translate into more accurate information in the written report. Maybe in court, but quite often not in the written report. So we really have to address the could have come from syndrome. Now, in Australia, we are close to New Zealand. Now, you probably know if you follow, all the Bayesian debate in New Zealand is really at the forefront of what's going on there. So we have a very strong, very strong views coming from New Zealand, and several people try to apply Bayesian statistics more and more. But it's probably fair to say as well that it's seen to be difficult by many practitioners and very difficult for laypersons to understand. So there is a real issue here. So this is the point here. The fundamental issue is really how can we put number, or if not, how can we conclude, how can we be serious about the interpretation and the actual weight of the evidence? This is a crucial point that I think we really have to try to address with trace evidence. Otherwise, we'll really always suffer in comparison with DNA. Some of the issues that were highlighted. So you've got this little graph, and it's pretty much about what Troy mentioned before. So if you put a graph of cost, timeliness versus and quality here, trace evidence is probably around here. So it's costly, and it's not often seen, to give a lot of value. So, economics realities for some administrators is pretty clear. It's maybe we should phase out some trace evidence types. Obviously there are a lot of risk and a lot of problems here, but the reconstruction of the scene and interpretation will always be important, and trace evidence will always be a very important point here. Over mentioned another point in terms of issues and challenges is over-specialization. And again, because we are not a big country with a big critical mass of people and cases, it's difficult to keep over-specialized people. So there is a financial issue here. But the same thing, another problem that we could see, it can be seen as ineffective in court. Because we need an expert for everything, every little point. So this is another issue. So what's going on in terms of strategic directions? How do we see how can we solve some of these issues? So this is the Australia-New Zealand views that we should try to move towards more forensic intelligence to direct investigations. We should, move towards or go back probably to a more generalist approach, really focus on criminalistics more than one specialized subdisciplines. The forensic triage here is very important up front. It's where we need multidisciplinary approaches to harvest the best potential evidence. More on-site analysis, it goes in hands with better forensic intelligence. So we can build here on the advantages of new technologies. So we hope that it will maximize the benefit of the central laboratory, and it will be at least part of the solution of case management that some other people would, it's a good name for backlog, really. So the future of criminalistic is more in the hands of crime scene investigators. So because new portable technologies, and as well in some jurisdictions, in Australia there is a distinction between volume crime and serious crime. And in volume crime there is a clear policy focus on DNA and fingerprints. So again, if trace evidence is not collected, so we cannot do anything about it. Another thing, when we talk about analysis and try to get more and more information and more results and so on, maybe we should think more in terms of quick retrieving of categorization level information rather than push the discrimination or the discriminating power. In other words, maybe we shouldn't be too much driven all the time with discrimination and discriminating powers and so on, but we should try to take a more class-level approach quickly, which can help with the triage, and then, if needed, go further. It provides a coherent approach across the board and fits with the intelligence drive. It will decrease the backlog. And it's pretty much what I said here, worry less about the apparent low discrimination abilities of trace evidence. And focus on the fact that it's really value-added source of information to reconstruct the case. Discrimination abilities, it's important, but it's not everything, it's not all. Quite often with trace evidence, we can retrieve information which is not possible to get from identifying types of evidence like fingerprints or DNA. Because what we have with trace evidence is the reconstruction of the event. We have the story. We don't have necessarily the identification, but we've got the story to back up the identification in some cases, or even to be prime forensic evidence. Now, on that point, Dr. Susan Bennett on Thursday, I think, we'll give a talk about a case study, a fiber case, which was interesting because trace evidence here wasn't a question about identification. It wasn't even debated in court in terms of source for the unknown samples of fibers. It was all about how these fibers could have come here, for how long they could have stayed there. So it's all a question of reconstruction. So these are very quick snapshot and quick views about how we see trace evidence from down under. I'd like to thank, of course, NIJ for the invite and all the members of the Australian New Zealand forensic science community, especially these people, John Buckleton, ESR, Dr. Hilton Cobus from the Forensic Science Centre in Adelaide, Professor Chris Leonard of the University of Canberra, James Robertson, of course, David Royds from the Federal Police, Kevin Walsh at ESI New Zealand, and Simon Walsh at the AFP in Canberra. And of course, you for listening. Thank you.